Hello, my name is Joshua Long, and I want to talk to you about Andrew Vachss and his career on the field of child protection. He was an author, an activist, an attorney, and I think that it's important to talk about the effect that he had as an inspiration to other people who want to work in this field. Andrew Vachss was born in Manhattan in 1942, graduated high school in 1960. He was unable to join the Marine Corps due to an injury around his eye, the muscles around his eye, which resulted in him wearing an eye patch that became iconic for most of his life. He wrote screenplays and short stories when he was in college and showed some talent for writing, but it's not a career he thought of for himself. And then he was recruited to work as a program representative for the U.S. Public Health Service to prevent the spread of venereal disease. And this experience had a big impact on his life. It sort of chose his trajectory. First of all, it taught him a lot of skills about how to find people who don't want to be found or who are difficult to track down. Because you try to identify all the people that one person comes to a clinic and has demonstrated that they have a venereal disease. Now you have to find everyone that person had sexual intercourse with, which in many cases was people they don't remember, or people they didn't catch their name, or could even be people who were working on the streets. And so he developed some skills that would come in handy when he's describing in his fiction novels private detectives who are in the seedy underbelly of New York City and trying to track down people who don't want to be found. That's probably where he learned a lot of those skills. But I think the most important event was when a man came in and had injuries to his genitals, and Andrew Vachss discovered the horrible truth that this man had been sexually abusing a child.
Here's a question from Paula Breeze. Was there a specific event that started you on the path you followed of passionately defending children and their rights?
There was a specific event, but it's not one that I can talk about with a lot of euphemisms. I was an investigator in sexually transmitted diseases for the federal government. What that meant back in the day was somebody come into the clinic with syphilis. You'd have to persuade that person to give you a list of all the people with whom he had sexual contact in the past 90 days, 6 months, sometimes a year. And then you had to find all those people. Well, remember, this is the late 60s, not now. People would not acknowledge a homosexual contact. They would not even acknowledge an adulterous contact without a lot of skillful interviewing. And even people who were honest with you and would tell you, look, I don't know her name. She was a whore. I met her in a bar. I paid her the money. I think her name was Mary, and I remember she was blonde. You'd have to find that Mary, and you'd have to find her and literally take blood from her in the field and make sure you could find her again, because if it popped up bad, you had a chance to crack an epidemic chain. I thought I was a pretty tough kid, I thought I'd seen what there was to be seen. It wasn't until someone came to the hospital with his genitals lacerated, told the nurse that he'd cut himself on a zipper. He told the wrong nurse. This was an old Army nurse. She came back while I was waiting in one of the rooms and said, I've seen that before, and he didn't do it to himself. And a little short time later, we found the baby that he'd penetrated without any kind of lubricant, and then went to the hospital because he was in pain, leaving the baby there. And I thought I met Satan, I thought I met the worst human being ever on earth. When I found out that he had comrades, that he had brothers, that he had sisters, that he was one of many such creatures, that's when my decision was made. It hasn't changed since.
After working for the Public Health Service, Vachss went to Biafra, a section of Nigeria during the Nigerian Civil War that wanted independence. And there was a war, and Biafra was surrounded and cut off from food supplies, and starvation was a weapon of war at the time. And it's not a war that people learn about too much today in standard curriculum of world history, but it was something that was very important at the time when it was happening. Now, because Andrew Vachss couldn't go to Vietnam because of his eye injury and because he wanted to help children, he thought that trying to get food to starving children would be a great use of his time. So he actually worked for the United Nations to see if the money that was given to charitable organizations was actually providing food to the civilian population, or was it even feasible to deliver food into this war zone. So Vachss flew in through a couple of channels. He had to go to Angola and then to the island of Sao Tome and then fly into Biafra. And he says that there were 2 planes flying through to make the trip. And one of the planes was shot down. And if you look it up, sure enough, there was a plane shot down around that time. And he was on the one that landed. But he wasn't so sure that he would ever leave because it was an active war zone. And in addition to seeing all kinds of horrible things while he was there, starving people, he had a couple of incidents that show up in his fiction work, which is one is he saw a woman who was holding a knife in one hand and a baby in the other while airplanes were dropping bombs around them. And he thought, what is a knife going to do against an airplane? But then when he saw the ferocity in the mother's eyes, he knew that he was dealing with something that, a phenomenon he hadn't thought about very much, which is the desperate desire to protect your children, and how some people have that and other people don't. And then at another incident he describes many times in his writing is seeing a child who was sitting down on the ground and smoking a cigarette. And there were bombs falling, and Andrew Vachss was running around trying to get cover, trying to protect himself from the shrapnel, and the child didn't move. He just sat there. And this gave him Vachss an up-close personal experience with how some people cope with trauma, which is to just sit down and not take steps to protect yourself because you could be hit by a bomb by running around. So why run? Why not stand still? And this could be a representation of learned helplessness in a traumatic situation, but it also shows the philosophical position of people who are horribly traumatized, which is to endure. These are attributes that would show up in many of the characters in his fictional books, and it would something that would recur in some of his other writing. And while he was in Nigeria, Andrew Vachss contracted malaria, and he had to be evacuated. And he came back to the United States and needed to do some work, but I think that around that time he realized that he would always be seeking opportunities to work where he could help people, the most disadvantaged people in society. So he went to Chicago and worked for an organization that was actually founded by Saul Alinsky, and he was a community organizer, you could say, helping people who were leaving prison go back to their communities. And this is when he first started to interact with people inside prisons and jails. And he started to meet people who grew up on the rough streets. Just like in New York, he had known a lot of tough people. He saw that it was common in other big cities too. He also met with a bunch of juvenile delinquents who were in and out of juvenile detention centers. And that gave him an interest in how you could try to help young offenders before they begin a life course of criminal behavior. Andrew Vachss moved to Massachusetts and took a position as a supervisor of a therapeutic community for violent juveniles. He attributed the fact he was chosen for the job being that he was one of the only people who wanted the job, but also to the fact that he was an articulate thug himself, having grown up on the streets. And I can add a personal anecdote here that I spoke with a man who had been involved in the Massachusetts juvenile justice system around that time. And as we were talking about the development of the juvenile justice system and all the different phases it went through, we talked about that facility, which was called the Andros facility. And I said, did you ever know Andrew Vachss? And he said, oh yeah, Andy, I knew him back when he was the warden. That's what he called him. And this guy told me some stories about Andrew Vachss that I've never seen in print anywhere, and said, oh yeah, he had the eye patch and he would be in his office. And one day he took this man into his office and pulled out a big rusted piece of metal that was all wrapped up, and it looked like a medieval mace with a big heavy blunt object on the end of a handle. And the guy said to Andrew Vachss, did one of the kids here make that as a weapon? And Vachss said, no, this is mine. I'm not under any illusions that these guys are dangerous, and I'm going to defend myself if they come in here. So just to let you know, Andrew Vachss was a real, genuine, tough guy. And at that facility, he met his future wife, Alice, who would go on to become an attorney and assistant district attorney in New York, who also was a huge influence on Andrew Vachss in his work and was represented as the character Wolf in the Burke series. In his experience of working in the facility, Andrew Vachss collected a lot of stories from the kids who were there and from the adults who were supposed to manage their behavior and rehabilitate them, and that would have a big influence on his later books. And he ended up writing a nonfiction book. His first published book is called The Lifestyle Violent Juvenile, published with Yitzhak Bakal, and very famous duo here, both of them well recognized in the field of child protection and rehabilitation. This book is, to begin with, this book is a criminological text that discusses the backgrounds of all the kids who were in this facility for being violent. And I think that as far as criminology goes, modern criminology, people could learn a lot from reading this, to go back and see that all the same factors that were most predictive of violent behavior 50 years ago are still present today. And in addition, the book also becomes kind of a guidebook or an architectural book to discuss what is the best way to design a facility to contain these kids so they can't hurt each other. How do they start out? How do they move through the therapeutic community, which is a euphemism for progressing from maximum security to medium to minimum, where they can finally get rehabilitative programming. And if they can't control their behavior, they have to stay in the maximum security settings. How do you deal with violent kids? You can't run it like a normal prison. And so this book is full of techniques. And I think most interestingly, at the end of this book are question and answer interviews, the text of interviews that Vachss himself conducted with some of the most violent gang members who were in the facility. It's a really incredible piece of work for any criminologist, and I recommend it to prison wardens who want to understand how to deal with the most difficult cases. Now, I'm going to read you a long quote from Andrew Vachss, where he had given a speech about the lifestyle violent juvenile that kind of summarizes the book. In discussing these violent juveniles, he said, "This kid does not relate behavior to consequences. He does not see a causal connection between his acts and a response. What do I mean? To this kid, life is a lottery. Everyone rolls the dice, but not everyone pays the price. He has no perception as to how the dice will come up. In his world, everyone commits crimes. Everybody. Some smaller percentage of that number are arrested. A still smaller percentage go to court. An even smaller percentage go to trial. A smaller percentage still are actually found guilty, for adjudicated delinquent if you prefer. And a smaller percentage of that group are committed to a youth authority. Lastly, an even smaller percentage are actually incarcerated. In his mind, everybody commits these crimes. He sees no connection between his acts and the consequences. He is marked by a chronicity of violence, usually an escalating pattern. Violence permeates his existence, and it is his existence. It is not the extent of his criminality that frightens us, but its regularity. Crime is not so much an occupation, in the sense of a professional criminal, but a way of life, with violence as the structural underpinning. Where does this kid come from anyway? Is he a biogenetic mutation that has evolved after hundreds of years of reproduction in the human race? I hope you don't believe that, and I hope you don't believe that he's a cultural aberration, or that once the economy gets back on its feet, he will disappear. I hope you don't believe it's as simplistic as breakdown of family values. Let me tell you something. He comes from us. He is a product of the human services profession. I have never seen one of these kids that hasn't been within our child protective and child caring system for years and years before the juvenile justice profession is asked to intervene. In order to create the kind of sociopathic, non-empathetic, violent human being I've been talking about, you need an institution. You need a controlled environment. You need an environment where might makes right. You need an environment where there is a hierarchy of exploitation, where the rule is, be exploited or exploit others. For many, many years, we have run our institutions on a jungle model, where the strong not only survive, but thrive. And when the beast is released, we all pay. We are just beginning to realize that the protection of children from child abuse is protection of society in the long run. We are finally waking up to the fact that victims don't just shrug off child abuse and go about their normal lives. And within that, I think it tells you quite a bit about Andrew Vachss and his developing worldview. Some things that would routinely show up in his conversations, interviews, and in his books is the belief that criminals are not born, they are created. And they're created through a process. and a failure of society to protect children from abuse. What about all the criminology textbooks? What about all the psychology books? Why doesn't he go through and cite hundreds of articles from academic researchers? Well, he talks about this in an autobiographical essay where he says, "I learned there was a science called criminology. I read every book with that magic word on the cover and reluctantly concluded that the science always seemed to come down to different people interpreting the same data to find different facts. Science wasn't the answer to injustice. It was a path, it was a tool." So he's going to be critical of a lot of the standard ways that people go about talking about crime and the development of crime and the lifestyle of violent juveniles. Andrew Vachss realized that he was not going to be able to have the impact on these children's lives that he wanted to have by waiting for them to go to jail. He had to intervene sooner, and he thought that the court system would be a better place to start. So he went to law school, the New England School of Law in Boston. And despite many hardships, he was first in his class, and he got a scholarship that allowed him to complete his law degree. It was almost like fate was intervening, or he was born to do this. He was great at argumentation. Andrew Vachss published a few times in law journals, in the New England Law Review, about parole and how it is that some people wrongly convicted or some people who are a low risk to the community might be able to be released, and all the different dimensions, almost looking for a risk assessment tool that would help people be released if they were not a threat to society. Andrew Vachss wanted to dedicate his law career to helping children exclusively, but since the children he wanted to represent didn't come from the best backgrounds, he needed income from another source so that he could provide inexpensive or free services to children. He thought that he would go back to writing fiction, and as he had written screenplays in college, he thought, well, what if he could sell some books? And so he wrote a book called A Bomb Built in Hell, which he referred to as a PhD thesis without the footnotes. And I consider this to be one of the greatest fiction books I've ever read. It's very dense. It is packed with a lot of criminology and psychology about dangerous, violent kids who come from abusive households, who are funneled through a remorseless criminal justice system, and they end up in prison. And when they go to prison, they don't learn how to get rehabilitated so they can go back home and pay their taxes. What they learn is how to become even more violent and better criminals. And in this case, he looked at this bomb built in hell, that this person was a bomb, and he might blow up and kill himself, and he might blow up and randomly kill people, but people could use him as a weapon. He wrote this book in 1972, but it was not published until 2012. And many publishers he sent the book to said that the subject matter was considered to be too harsh, too extreme, too unrealistic. And the book follows the criminal career of Wesley, a man who grew up in extreme adversity, wound up in prison, and was chosen by a dying mafia leader to become his bomb to go and get revenge. But after he gets all the revenge he needs, he looks out and he decides that he'll get revenge against society. And he does something that at the time was considered to be implausible. No one would ever do something like that. No one would ever kill large numbers of children in a school. Until 2012, it was pretty obvious that there are people who do things like that. And maybe it would be interesting to know some potential theories of why they got that way. But it was published actually in a short story format in an anthology called A Matter of Crime, and A Bomb Built in Hell, a truncated version of it, is included in there. And I happen to know a man who got inspiration from this short story and wanted to smuggle drugs into a prison, like rat poison and cyanide, so that they could use it to poison and kill people inside the prison, which is a theme that shows up in Andrew Vachss' book. Andrew Vachss wrote a lot of op-ed articles for newspapers, and he also did a lot of interviews. And I think that this was one way his activism was able to get out to the public. And so there was one article that I found to be really powerful, and it was called, "Are You Going to Hurt Me Too?" So in October 1985, he published this, and he said, "A 4-year-old boy, one side of his face swathed in bandages and his arms covered with cigarette burns, asked the lawyer who's been introduced to him by social workers, Are you going to hurt me too? I was that lawyer. This young boy and hundreds of thousands of children like him has learned to fear the world of adults. The child who asks, "Are you going to hurt me too?" is really speaking to all of us, to society at large. And if we face the hard realities, the truthful answer may well be yes. And so he came up with a list of 10 things we could do to try to make the world better for children, to try to protect them from abuse. And these 10 things could all be applied today because they were not totally fixed. But I will talk about his impact in correcting some of these things. One is, he said, reported cases should be investigated by professionally trained fact finders, not social workers, whose social philosophy place rehabilitation of offenders over the safety of victims. Number 2, protection and rehabilitation efforts should not be conducted by the same social workers. Number 3, children should be protected from incest offenders, not kept in the same house. Number 4, ongoing reunification efforts deprive victims of a normal childhood. Number 5, we should establish irreducible minimum standards for parenting. Parenting is not a right, it's a responsibility. Number 6, confidentiality in family courts should not be used to protect abusers. The press should be a force for social change. So we can't let all these cases go under the radar because it's in the family court rather than the criminal court. Number 7, government agencies and foster parents should be held to strict standards and receive penalties for maltreatment of children. Number 8, children should not be placed in indefinite foster care while their parents receive counseling. They need permanent homes, not foster care. Social workers should be psychiatrically screened before being allowed to work in the system. Number 10, we should adopt a triage mentality to protect children and only attempt to rehabilitate families who are capable of rehabilitation. And he said, society has a finite amount of resources, and it should also have a finite amount of tolerance for child abuse.
This is what you have to do if you're a Child Protective Services worker. You have to go places where no cop would go alone, unarmed, with no radio contact, knock on a door, not know what's inside. And when you get inside, you have the very simple task of protecting the child and rehabilitating the parents simultaneously. And for this, we'll give you a lot less money than we pay people who pick up garbage. If you want to actually step up to the front lines, there's a million ways to do it. Law enforcement does it. Nurses do it. Doctors do it. Social workers do it. It's the choice that you make of how you're going to use the skills you've acquired. There's no one child protective job. There's a million of them. So you could pick your spot. If you want to do something about actual trafficking, you need to be an FBI agent. And the federal government's got to start funding the FBI to do something about this instead of funding these public service announcements.
Even though Andrew Vachss' first book, A Bomb Built in Hell, was not accepted by publishers, he wanted to keep on writing. And he wanted to write something that would capture people's attention, and then he could sneak in a bunch of stories about child abuse in order to wake up the public and make them aware of situations they probably didn't know about. So what he decided to do was to write a book that was about a private detective. And you know the type, the crime noir, Maltese Falcon kind of story. But he wanted it to be grittier and more realistic and to focus on child abuse. It's not just about catching someone in the act of committing a crime. It's not just about tracking someone down or solving a murder. It's about the trauma and recovering from trauma. And so in a sense, his books were going to be Trojan horses. And he said, I intended the book as a Trojan horse, a crime novel that pulls the reader into the story at the same time it delivers a steady diet of hardcore reality. I didn't own a radio station or a newspaper or a television network, but this was a working man's propaganda bulletin, and I never pretended it was anything else. And then he said, I learned a long time ago that people can read for entertainment and come away with enlightenment. And that's when he began the Burke series. Now, the Burke series is an incredible series of books, and I'm not going to tell you the plot of everything. There are some other YouTube channels that have discussed the Burke and all the characters and the stories. I just want to give you an overview of the 18 books that the most important parts that stood out to me. First of all, who is Burke? Well, Burke is baby boy Burke. On his birth certificate, it didn't have his mother's name, and it didn't have his father's name. And they didn't have a name. And so they just called him Burke, and his first name was Baby Boy. Of course, being an orphaned child, completely abandoned, he would go into the foster care social service system, and he was horribly abused. He ended up going to jail, going to prison, and serving a couple of terms in prison. And by the time the book starts, the first book in the series is called Flood. He is now out of prison, not on parole, and he runs a private detective agency. Of course, it's just a cover, and what he really does is rip people off and burglarize houses and still commit crimes, but he's much more careful. In fact, you could say the defining characteristic of Burke is that he is the most careful and planning and plotting person that I've ever seen in any book. He's hyper vigilant. In all of fiction, I've never seen anybody who is so paranoid, but who does it in such a confident and aggressive way. So to give you an example, at one scene in the first book, Flood, he's stopping to pick up a friend to get in his car. And most of us would imagine you pull up, you park your car, and you wait. But Burke can't do that because he's so hyper vigilant. So he pulls the car to the curb, keeps his foot on the brake, disengages the brake lights so it looks like he's in park and not just holding his foot on the brake. And he holds up a newspaper over his face, but he punches a hole through it with an ice pick so he can look at the mirror and see behind him and in front of him at the same time while appearing to be reading the newspaper. The kind of hysterical paranoia is really a traumatic response. He's been traumatized so many times in his life, plus pretty much living inside prisons for most of his adult life. He knows that you have to look over your shoulder and you shouldn't trust anybody. That makes it very interesting to see his character develop over time because he does have friends. He has people that he considers to be part of his family of choice. And I'm going to read one section here from my favorite of the Burke series is called Sacrifice. And if you were to read I recommend reading all of his books, but if you start reading the Burke series, you should start with Flood and go in order. Flood, Striga, Bluebell, Hard Candy, Blossom, and Sacrifice. Don't stop until you complete Sacrifice, because this is my favorite one. And then after that, you'll probably want to finish the series so you can see the full development of all the characters. You'll be hooked by then. So this will give you plenty of reading to do over the next year. But I'm going to read this section to you, and I want you to think about it. I live under the darkness where it's safe from things so secret that they have no name. Under the darkness, it's not territory you occupy. You take it with you. It goes where I go, where I've been. The orphanage, reform school, prison, even now. There's others like me, children of the secret, raised by so many different humans, those who ignored us, those who tortured us. No place to run, so survival becomes all. For us, a religion, nourished on lies so that we alone know the truth. An army of us. You can't see us, but we find each other, like a special breed of damaged dog, responding only to the silent whistle. All things come to those who wait. Some of us wait in ambush.
Tuning in already know what family of choice means, but can you talk about that a little bit?
Family of choice is real simple. Too many people believe in DNA like it's a religion.
You must get a lot of people who read the books and a light bulb goes off and they think, oh yeah, that's my life.
Yes. It's probably the prototypical response to the books. Of all the responses to the books, the one I can count on is people who say, you're writing about me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But Andrew Vachss didn't just write the Burke series. He wrote many other books. So, for example, the Aftershock, Shockwave, and Sine Wave books, and then Blackjack, Urban Renewal, Drawing Dead. He also wrote some standalone books. So, That's How I Roll, Two Trains Running, The Wait. And two that I really like is The Getaway Man, which is kind of like a Jim Thompson crime story where trying to pull off a heist. And the getaway man just wants to drive the car. That's his passion. That's his life. And that is such a good short book. It's like a dime store novel. And I think it's really good. It shows that he could have fun while talking about these things and talk about it in an extremely entertaining way. You could make a great movie out of that book, The Getaway Man. But I think my favorite book of his is not from the Burke series. My favorite book of Andrew Vachss is called Shella. So it's a quest to find Shella. The main character is a man, and it follows this individual as he gets out of prison and he wants to find Shella. And you don't really know why he wants to find her, but you know that he's going to try everything he can. He'll travel the whole country and try to find her. This book is so incredible. He goes on all these adventures, and it turns out that he's a very deadly man. And it covers a lot of topics that are very important, such as radicalization and extremism and white supremacist groups that he has to infiltrate. But I would say, I wish I could tell you the ending of the book, but I can't because I want you to read it. If you read any books of his, you should read Shella. And in the final pages of the book, after you're done reading it, you might think to yourself, well, that's Andrew Vachss going too far. That's him describing something that's not a Trojan horse. He's not taking a real life case and then turning it into fiction in order to draw attention to a problem. He's invented one of the most horrifying things ever in any book. But after you're done reading Shella, I think you should read Anna Salter's book, Transforming Trauma. And if you get the paperback version of this book, on page 271 at the bottom of the page, it describes exactly the phenomenon that you see at the end of Shella. So you see then that he's not making anything up. And that's the tragedy of these books. Like on the one hand, they're very well written. It's entertaining in the sense that they kind of tell a revenge story, so bad things happen and you get to see the bad guys get what they deserve at the end. But then you realize in real life, there's no happy ending. There's no little revenge plot where the bad guy got what was coming to him. He also had several short story compilations, and I think these are all excellent. These are things that might have made their way into a full-length book at some point, but he decided to deliver them in a short story format. My favorite is called Born Bad. It's also worth noting that he wrote some comic books too, and I haven't had a chance to read any of the comic books, but some of them are based on his own stories and others are based in other universes, like the Predator versus Alien series and Batman. Now, I did read his book, Batman the Ultimate Evil, and you think, well, what is Batman fighting against? Bank robbers, some person in a funny costume and who steals an egg from a museum. But in this story, Batman is fighting the ultimate evil, child sex trafficking. And if you think that sounds incongruous, like how can you take a child's comic book hero and turn him into this very, very dark vigilante? Well, Andrew Vachss found a way as a Trojan horse to once again get his message across.
Writing for me has never been an expression of creativity. It's never been a catharsis. I was not born to be a writer. I haven't read most of the great books. For me, it's been a weapon of war.
He also wrote some children's books for adults. One is called Another Chance to Get It Right, and it's almost poetic in its short form analysis of important topics related to trauma. And another one is Heart Transplant. And with this, he had some co-authors. And Zach Mucha, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, is a licensed social worker and has a lot of experience dealing with teenagers who suffer from the trauma of bullying. And maybe bullying is just another example of something that our society turns a blind eye to, says it's not a big deal, but in reality, it's something that can have a big impact on people. In 1993, Andrew Vachss went on the Oprah Winfrey Show, became much more famous after that, and probably sold many more books, and got to spread his message. And what I think is so interesting about his interaction with Oprah is that he confronted her, he argued with her, and he was a very confrontational person, but he was trying to drive a point home. He wanted to say, you don't have to forgive people who abuse you when you're a kid. You're allowed to be angry. And in fact, anger, righteous rage, might be something that you could channel that energy into solving problems.
You would not tolerate what happened to you
No, I would
to
not.
happen to anybody else.
No, I would not.
So you were saying that you're less than them, they have diminished you in some way, that they have no right to do, and for that they deserve your anger.
So what should I be doing?
I think you can't really, I think you can dismiss them
Yeah.
after first being honest and say, I hate you for what you did.
Do I hate them or do I hate what they did?
By me,
Yeah.
this long,
Yeah.
this behavior, you hate them. It's very easy to separate and say, oh, you hate the sin, but you love the sinner.
Yeah.
That's for somebody who gets drunk or has an affair or punches a guy in the mouth in a bar. It's not for somebody who violates and betrays the sacred trust of a child to an adult. It's not someone who abuses power that way for their own sexual gratification. They're not in that category for me.
He was also familiar with another person who knows Oprah Winfrey really well, wrote some books with her, and that's Bruce Perry, who is a psychiatrist who works in the Child Trauma Academy and Prevent Child Abuse America. He wrote a book called What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. He wrote a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog in Extreme Child Abuse and Child Neglect Situations. But I think my favorite book by Bruce Perry is called Born for Love, and it's about how human beings need empathy and compassion and a bond, a connection with others. And if you're deprived of that during your early years, what kind of effect does that have on you across your life course? That's everything that Andrew Vachss was trying to get across in his books, and to him, Bruce Perry was Andrew Vachss' hero. And Oprah Winfrey was the person who opened up all this conversation to the public and helped them get the message across. So it was an interesting little team there. Also in 1993, Andrew Vachss went to the White House and met with President Bill Clinton right before he signed the National Child Protection Act. The National Child Protection Act established a national criminal history background check system to which a designated agency in each state was required to report child abuse crime information. And they had to index that information in the system for the purposes of background checks for child care providers. And what that means is, Andrew Vachss said something really sarcastic in one of his books, and I thought it was sarcasm because it's coming through Burke, and Burke was, pretty sardonic. But at one point, Burke says something like, this guy committed all these crimes, sexually abused all these kids, and then he opened a daycare center when he got out of prison. And I thought, come on, they can't open a daycare center. Well, the reason they can't open a daycare center is because Andrew Vachss pointed out that they could, because there's no background check system nationally, and a man can commit horrible crimes in New York and move to Florida or California, and he could then open a daycare center and nobody would know. And so having the national background check system could have prevented who knows how many crimes. And we still have enough of those crimes happening today that anything we can do to reduce them is great. So Andrew Vachss was not a big fan of all the crime legislation that was passed in the 1990s, but this is one that he put his stamp of approval on. One thing that people often talk about is chemical castration of sex offenders, and that if you pump them full of drugs, that will reduce the likelihood of offending. And the idea was that they wouldn't have to go to prison then, that you could sexually abuse a child, take your medicine, and you don't have to go to the prison. And a journal, the American Bar Association Journal in 1992, asked experts, do you think we should allow sex offenders to get out of prison if they take castration chemicals? And one person, Douglas Besharov, he said yes. He said, yeah, it's kind of coercive to make them take it in lieu of punishment, but we can't take away their right to take medicine if they want to. So if they want to take medicine, sure. Andrew Vachss said no. He said we should not use chemical castration as an alternative to punishment. And he had some very interesting reasons for saying this. First of all, he said, castration gives a medical excuse to predators. Castration will be used as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Castration will be blamed for causing violent acts. And sadists, the people who really torture children, will, instead of using sex, use a different weapon. They might use, for example, some other instrument to cause trauma to a child. So giving them chemical castration might get rid of the sex drive, but it's not going to change the fact that sadists enjoy torturing you emotionally, psychologically, and physically, not just sexually. He also said castrated offenders will brood on their situation and seek revenge. They'll say, look what you've done to me, and then they'll seek revenge in another way. And he said chemical castration is not foolproof. You can override it. You could just not take your medicine. And then you have the cover of taking medicine. No one will think that you're the one who committed the crime, when in reality you're skating by. And he summarized this by saying, America loves simple solutions to complex problems. And I think that that was something that would always characterize him in his arguments as he goes on. So the response to his books was positive. Lots of people love his books. And some people said he's a fascist by saying bad things about pedophiles. For example, the North American Man-Boy Love Association had a bulletin where they said Andrew Vachss was a fascist who was inciting violence against pedophiles. And someone asked him about that, and he said, I don't meet a whole lot of people without an agenda, so I don't know what's really in their mind. All I can do is be consistent and truthful. Am I shocked that the NAMBLA Bulletin called me a fascist? No. But do I think they're objective reviewers? Of course not. And in his mind, if you're going to call someone a fascist because they want tough penalties for people who sexually abuse children, then you must not like it when powerful people use their power to hurt others, to hurt the weak and vulnerable. So then how could you possibly turn a blind eye to child abuse? That is the ultimate fascism. He said the ultimate fascism is child abuse. Its victims are prisoners of war without a Geneva Convention to protect them, hostages to terrorism. As in all concentration camps, some prisoners imitate the oppressors. No surprise that the uninterrupted transgenerational abuse of children produces the most fervent followers of fascism. So if you really want to fight against fascism, maybe we should protect children and stop being so soft on child abuse crimes. One thing that in the early 2000s that Andrew Vachss was drawing attention to was a thing called the incest loophole. And by this he describes a law in New York that said that you could sexually abuse your own child and then go to family court and not be charged with a crime. But if you sexually abuse your neighbor's child, you would be charged with a crime and face, potentially, stiff penalties. So he said, what if I told you that a father who was regularly raping his 8-year-old daughter could reasonably expect to avoid prison if he were discovered? You'd be outraged, right? But this is a fact of life in New York thanks to the incest loophole, and nobody in the legislature is even trying to change this reprehensible law. And this was an op-ed in the New York Times. And he went on to describe this. He said, in New York, sex with a child under the age of 11 is a Class B felony punishable by up to 25 years in prison. The law is indexed appropriately in the chapter on sex offenses. If, however, the sexually abused child is closely related to the perpetrator, state law provides for radically more lenient treatment. In such cases, the prosecutor may choose to charge the same acts as incest. This is not listed as a sex offense, but instead as an offense affecting the marital relationship, listed next to adultery in the law books. It is a Class E felony, for which even a convicted offender may be granted probation. Probation is available because the law considers incest with a child to be a non-violent crime, but the fact that physical force is rarely required for a parent to violate a child does not make the crime non-violent. Incest is, most typically, rape by extortion, with parents abusing their position to induce compliance from victims whose every aspect of life is under the perpetrator's control. Entitling those who commit such crimes to a legislative get-out-of-jail-free card is indefensible. Now, interestingly, after his op-ed came out, the district attorney and a state legislator both took out op-eds saying that Andrew Vachss was wrong. They said, there is no evidence that we use this incest loophole to help people get away with their crimes. Name one case. And Andrew Vachss said, in the greatest rebuttal ever, if you don't use this loophole, then why not remove it from the law books? Why not make this a Class B felony? And they didn't want to. They wanted to keep it on the books because they were using it as an incest loophole. And but it was passed in, I believe, 2006, and the law was changed, so now New York doesn't have this incest loophole. Now you might, lawyers argue back and forth about things like this, but I want to bring up a point is that I used to have a job as a caseworker in a children's services department, and the incest loophole is alive today. But what you do instead of charging someone with an incest crime is you don't charge them with a crime at all. You say there's not enough evidence, and you close the case. And the mother takes the kids over to the family court and gets a restraining order, and so the family court will then require the children's visits with their father to be supervised. And one of my jobs was to sit behind glass and watch fathers interact with their children when it was known that those fathers were sexually abusing the children. We just couldn't prove it in a court of law, in a criminal court. And so the incest loophole is de facto still alive, but it's not codified into law in New York anymore. So that was another victory of Andrew Vachss. And in addition to all of his books, he obviously had a big inspiration on others, and it goes both ways. So Alice Vachss, his wife, wrote an incredible book called Sex Crimes, which was then updated to Sex Crimes Then and Now. And it's a whistleblowing book on my years in the front lines prosecuting rapists and confronting their collaborators. That judges collaborate with defense attorneys to help rapists get back on the street as soon as possible. And prosecutors who are in this process are supposed to represent the state. They don't represent the child. And they would haggle and take a plea deal. That book is incredible, and I highly recommend that you read it. Everyone who studies unfairness in the criminal justice system has to understand how the plea bargaining process ruins our attempts at justice. But Alice Vachss very recently has written a book called OBAT, or One Bully at a Time. And this is a fiction book. One Bully at a Time is about a group of teenagers who are in school and they're dealing with bullies, and they help each other and comfort each other. So you get that circle of trust, friendship between a small group of kids. And when one was being bullied and traumatized, the others are there to provide a social bond and support and protection. And they decide they want to fight against bullies. Well, how do teenagers fight bullies? So what they start is a news bulletin on social media, and whenever bullies are doing something, they name them and shame them. And it's a good, almost kind of a mystery novel towards the end. And I thought it was very good. And it shows that a lot of the things that cause trauma for people extend far beyond what you may think. Another person heavily influenced by Andrew Vachss is Zach Mucha, licensed social worker. And he wrote a fiction book called The Beggar's Shore, but he also wrote a nonfiction book, a memoir in a way, of his work in Chicago, working with he's a street corner social worker to help homeless men and women get into temporary housing, to get off drugs, to get medical care and mental health care, and dealing with people who are suffering from acute psychosis. And it's called Swimming to the Horizon. Another person who's heavily influenced by Andrew Vachss and was good friends with him is a real-life private detective named John Curley, who wrote 3 books, Bond, Sorrows, and Harbingers. And it's about a man named Jonathan Creed. He's not exactly a Burke character, but he's a tough guy. And he goes through a lot of adventures. And also, these books are Trojan horses. They expose the seedy underbelly that still exists in New York. Now, my favorite author who was influenced by Andrew Vachss and was no doubt an influence on him is Dr. Anna Salter, who is a famous psychologist who literally wrote the book on sex offender rehabilitation and victim treatment, victim therapy, and also wrote a very famous book called Predators on how to protect your family from the deception and grooming tactics of child abusers. So I'm going to actually make a whole separate video about Anna Salter, and I hope you'll watch that if you are interested in child protection. But she wrote 5 fiction books too, and I have no doubt they were influenced by Andrew Vachss to some extent, at least in the sense that they're a Trojan horse that helps her convey information about cases so that people can be aware of just the full extent of these crimes. But they have very little in common with the Burke series. So whereas the Burke series is about a rough and tumble, gritty private detective with a horrible history of abuse, who's been in and out of prison, who fights like these pimps in Times Square and, even throws grenades at people. These books, the first 4, Shiny Water, Fault Lines, White Lies, and Prison Blues, are about a character for a psychologist based on Anna Salter's own experience who works with sex offenders. And they become mystery novels, and there is adventure and danger in these books, but it's in Vermont, in a rural setting, next to a hospital. And so the cases she gets are not these monsters from the underworld. They're hidden monsters. And that's a theme that shows up in all of Anna Salter's work, nonfiction and fiction, is the camouflage that predators have. And that they could be a surgeon or a lawyer or a psychiatrist. and they can abuse kids. And how can you detect people's lies? How can you create safety for children when a man walks in a three-piece suit into a courtroom with a big smile on his face? When a man walks into a courtroom in a three-piece suit with a big smile on his face and says that he's a surgeon, is a judge ever going to believe that they could harm a child? It's an interesting way of expanding the scope of child protection through the medium of fiction books by showing that these crimes happen. There's no socioeconomic status for child sex abusers. It's everywhere. And the fifth book is actually a different character. It's not based on the same ones as the first four, which is a shame because I love the first four. But this book also is incredible. It's called Truth Catcher, and it's about another forensic psychologist who works with victims and offenders, and she does assessments to see if they can be safely released or if they should be civilly committed to a hospital when offenders are leaving prison. And she has to understand how to detect lies in people's voices, and it's an interesting book. I'll talk more about it in a separate video. Andrew Vachss unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and he had finished a manuscript for a book which was then published posthumously, and it's called Bloodline. And this is a book that goes back to his roots. With A Bomb Built in Hell, it's about, Wesley, this assassin who had a terrible childhood, and he goes on going around killing people. He's a very good hitman. Well, this book is also about a man who was abused as a child and goes on to become a hitman. But because he's a hitman, he makes a bunch of money, and he lives a nice, quiet life. And it's all a cover. But he's part of a mission, a grand mission, to take children away from abusive homes where people are selling their children, and rather than let them be sold to a predator, they're sold to people who want to save them. And so this man who's a hitman gets a child and raises him as his own son. And when he does this, his son grows up and doesn't know he's going to have to continue the bloodline. He's going to have to become a hitman someday. And the main character isn't really sure he wants his son to go through this transformation. Well, his son is really good with computers. And this is one thing you notice with Andrew Vachss books. If there could be any criticism of the Berg series, is that some people might consider it to be outdated, because you're talking about a time period before cell phones, a time period before the internet. And as you see the Berg series unfold, Andrew Vachss was actually on the cutting edge of technology. He talks about online child pornography networks when the internet was just beginning. He talks about whether people can track your phone call and your mobile phone in your car. And it's a little bit outdated, and it makes you wonder, what would he do if he wrote a book today with all of our massive technology and social media? Well, this is his book where he talks about how social media will be used to catfish or recruit juveniles online for the purpose of sexually exploiting them. And so they have to do some detective work using Facebook or other types of social media. And I think it's a great way to show that Andrew Vachss books covered a huge time period of change and development, both on the part of predators using technology to hurt people and on the part of investigators trying to rescue children using technology. And so that's great. But I think probably the best thing about this is that this book is about passing the torch to a new generation. People did stuff the old way. What can we do to help kids in a new way? And he passes just as the main character passes the torch to his son and uses technology to rescue people. In the same way, this book is passing the torch to a new generation of writers and authors. He wants other people to carry on this crusade. And as he said, it's a Trojan horse. You write a fiction story and you push that out to the public, and if it's written well, you're going to be getting the message across. You can go out and do lots of things to help people. And that was, it's kind of an interesting way for us to carry on Andrew Vachss' work, that he left the footprints in the sand and we're going to follow in his footsteps. I personally tried to write a book, and I'm nowhere near as good as Andrew Vachss, but I was inspired by him to try. And it was a great therapeutic experience. I thought it was wonderful. A great chance to get out all my thoughts. And what I lack in technique is, maybe someday I'll write something good. But that's just one way that you could be an activist. If you want to continue Andrew Vachss' mission, you should follow these steps that he pointed out on his website. He thinks that systematizing the process of asset forfeiture in child sexual exploitation cases would be a good way to help victims and punish offenders. In other words, when someone is selling child pornography, take all their money and give it to victims. Number two, eliminate the flawed language in the law that allows children to be represented by lay volunteers. So, for example, in the state that I live in, you could work in CASA, Court-Appointed Special Advocate, which is something I'm going to do. But what you really need is a lawyer, not someone like me who doesn't have a law degree. So if I go and volunteer and I want to do a good job in CASA, I can probably help kids, sure. But if I was a lawyer, I would be far more effective. A lay volunteer is not as good as a bar authorized lawyer. A guardians ad litem. You can, in my state, you can be a guardian ad litem without a law degree. You could be a good guardian ad litem, but you're not a lawyer, so you're going to mess up eventually. So he thinks that lawyers should be guardians of children in the courtroom to represent the child's best interest. He also thinks we should construct a model secure treatment unit for violent youth. So going all the way back to his original work in dealing with the lifestyle violent juvenile in a correctional center, he doesn't think that we can just put these kids in a jail for kids and paint the walls a pretty color and call it a residency center or something like that, some euphemism. He thinks that we're going to have to build special secure treatment centers where violent youth can get detailed, focused therapy for their specific needs. And to not be naive about this, that these are violent kids because they took a lot of bad things to happen to these kids to get them to that stage. Fixing their problems is not going to be easy. Number 4, he wants to induce politicians to focus child protective efforts on circle of trust crimes. So obviously, we're all concerned about stranger danger. And if 10% of sex crimes are committed by strangers, you think about it proportionally, how much time do kids spend with strangers? Yeah, strangers are a big problem. Those where the predators are hunting children. We should do stuff like that. But it seems like politicians and the government, a lot of law enforcement agencies, focus so much effort on strangers that they don't talk about the much larger problem, 90% of sex crimes, of people in the circle of trust, family and acquaintances and school teachers and people at the church and the sports and the people who have power over kids. Instead of disproportionately allocating our resources to stranger crimes, we should also try to help children who are trapped in an abusive household. Number 5, this is the one that I think that if I'm going to do anything, it'll be this one. To weed out judges, prosecutors, and Children's Services Agency officials by making agency data available, transparent, to produce regular reports for the public, and then we can remove the poor performers from their positions. So if you've got a prosecutor who makes plea deals every single time, if you've got a judge who gives probation and lenient sentences, and if you've got a children's service agency that botches cases and unnecessarily removes kids from homes or doesn't remove kids from homes where they're being abused, we need to fire those government employees and hire new people who will be held to a high standard. Andrew Vachss started a group. He started several groups throughout his life, but the one that he had the most faith in is the Legislative Drafting Institute for Child Protection, where attorneys and researchers get together and make policy recommendations to states and local government on ways that they can fix the systemic issues, the big picture issues, to facilitate helping children. And you could donate money to this organization, and that's one place that I think that your money would be wisely spent. You can also go on his website called The Zero, which is the name is influenced from one of an event in one of the Burke novels. And this website has hundreds of articles and interviews and samples of his writing and all the things that he had done throughout his life. And this is where I got a lot of my information for making this video. It also has a list of all of his books and links. You can go and buy them. And I highly recommend you go to The Zero. You could also join us on Facebook. There's a group called The Zero. And we all, or if you follow the page, the group, we post articles and ideas, and every day you get a new quote from Andrew Vachss just to keep his legacy alive. I have some personal book recommendations, and I hope that you'll pick these up. Number one, you have to read Shella. It's by far the best book he ever wrote, and one of the best books I've ever read, but it is a really painful book. It hurts to read, especially the ending is like being stabbed. Number two, A Bomb Built in Hell. I think that this book is also incredible. It was his first book, and it's a product of its time, but in that sense, it's historical, and I think you should read it. It's incredible. Number three is The Getaway Man, and this one's a little bit more fun. The stakes aren't as high. It's not Burke. It's not dealing so much with child abuse as it is trying to pull off a great crime. How do you pull off a crime? How do you get away with it? And it's the most ingenious heist plot I've ever seen. Really good. Number four, though, is you should definitely read the Burke series. And I could list all 18 books, but I think you should read Flood, which is great. I just read it again yesterday for like the 10th time. And then work your way through the first couple of books until you get to Sacrifice. And Sacrifice was the 6th in the series, but I think it's his best book. And if you make it to Sacrifice, I'm sure you'll finish the rest. But don't deprive yourself of Sacrifice just so if you don't really like, let's say, Hard Candy or Blossom, I think those are good books, but Sacrifice is so much better. You have to get all the way to Sacrifice. And number five, I like the book The Wait. It's one of his, a one-off book, a standalone book, and it's about a guy who gets out of prison, and he's going on a mission, and he meets some people, and there's a little bit of betrayal, a little bit of who's the betrayer, and I like it. And number six is Mortal Lock. It's a group of short stories, and one of the short stories in there is called Placebo, and it's real short, very impactful, and it tells you everything you need to know about Andrew Vachss in one short story, Placebo. Also, I want to thank Andrew Vachss for introducing me to Judy Henske, music I'd never heard before, shows up repeatedly in his books, and also to my goal in life is now to get a Neapolitan Mastiff, which is a dog that shows up in his books. So just to let you know, this is a wide universe with all kinds of interesting ideas, and Andrew Vachss was a very interesting guy. And his music, the food he likes, the dogs he likes, it all shows up, and his personality comes through the books really, really well. I want to leave you with one quote. Of all the things I've read of Andrew Vachss, and I think I've read probably 90% of it, I'll go get the comic books next. But the quote that I think is the most impactful is this: humanity's worst crime exists in no statute book. What would the lawmakers call the theft of childhood? And Andrew Vachss died in November 2021. He's a hero to a lot of people. He's had a big impact on individuals and on the system and legislation and literary. I'm not a literary critic, but when you can take someone who's not literary and have them sit down and write a book of their own, obviously he has a big influence on a lot of people. So Andrew Vachss, a great work, great life, dedicated to helping others, and he's an inspiration to anyone else who wants to follow in those footsteps.